the other classes this morning. It was quite fun watching the cat try and, roll around their head and stuff.
For real. Hey, hey, hey. Okay, so I'm going to be trying to navigate that while I'm doing this. So I'm Marguerite, by the way. I'm a very recent Laurel in Artemisia. I'm the Artemisian baby Laurel, largely for enameling and other general arts. This class is mostly based off of a Kingdom A&S entry that I did a few years ago about counterfeiting quartz to simulate what are called ballast rubies in like the Elizabethan era, or also like spinels are what we think of them. And I just had a really good time doing that, and I thought it'd be really good to theme. So that's what we'll be doing today. Oh my goodness, my love. Can you grab her? Sorry. Can everybody hear me okay? I'm getting over COVID, but I have a really terrible cough, so I apologize for that in advance. Please take it seriously, it's no joke. So all right. I'm gonna get my slide up right now. Come on. And then I'm gonna share my screen. Sorry, this is just taking a minute. Can you guys see that? I am very
Yes.
love it. So that I have two screens up myself, but I'm trying to only share the one so like I have my notes up and stuff. So if it doesn't work, please let me know and I'll flail about wildly. But no. Okay. So again, this is sort of my introductory to doing this as a class. My goal was to try and do a demonstration. Nope, that way. But then I got sick, so sorry. But it is like super easy. Like I went really like deep down in the rabbit hole of like researching this really well and finding all the different angles to take with it. But at the end of the day, like you just put it in an oven and then you put it in a bowl of dye. Like it's super easy. But I'll let you know kind of what the background is for everything as well. Cause like I said, this is all like super interesting to me. So the Cheapside Hoard is this amazing resource we have for late period jewelry. Very late period. I mean, like kind of 1590s at best, into like 17th century stuff. But the Museum of London, for their part, date pretty much everything to at least as far back as like the late 16th century. So like we get it. We got it in the SCA. So we're good. They have two extant examples, both of which are actually very similar, of these actual pieces, which are which they call counterfeit rubies or counterfeit ballast rubies, from the Museum of London. And so they're able to do some chemical analysis of them to find out like what they actually are. The other sort of written resources we have, because I think I saw somebody else with this book too, and please forgive me, I have children, they destroy everything, is London's Lost Jewels, which is an amazing book if you are interested in jewelry at all, and also Elizabethan material culture, Elizabethan life. There's so much good stuff in here about like the goldsmith guild system, like and so much tea. Like there's just so much tea in this book. It's so funny. And this is like one of the most hilarious things I found, because like there's named people who were tried by the Goldsmiths Company of London for doing this stuff. And we have the object and we have the notes on it, and it's so cool, I think.
In this edition, it's on page 70.
Yeah. You need to not crawl up in here and try and get on screen. Stop it. Thank you. Sorry. But there's kind of a multifaceted approach of like, we have these like really evocative material objects that we can date very specifically to a time and place that happens to more or less be within our period. And we have these very well kept notes by this guild that like it is highly likely, and I think possibly impossible for it not to, for the Cheapside hoard to have been held by a member of the Goldsmiths Company of London. Cheapside was where all of the jewelers and goldsmiths lived and worked and sold their wares. And why it's called the Cheapside hoard is because they were held, they were stuffed in a wall somewhere that they pulled out in like 1900. So we have like a really solid date, and basically they are entirely certain that like they were there the whole time. They survived the Great Fire of London. They survived hundreds of years just sitting in the dirt. The pearls didn't survive all that well. They kind of dissolved, but everything else stayed more or less intact in really good condition, including these two objects. And so they did some chemical analyses that we'll kind of go over a little bit later. But I really enjoyed how between these two things of the written record and the extant objects, we're able to get a really nice complete picture as to what they were and how they may have been created. So, all right. And again, just doing a quick check, we're all seeing the slideshow okay? I don't see the slideshow in Zoom, so like I'm just I just have to take it on faith that it's there.
We're good. We can see it.
So, my goodness, I'm so sorry. So one thing to understand about the stone, like the stone that they're trying to counterfeit, is that at this time period, mineralogy was like not nearly as advanced that it is now. It was not lacking in advancement. Like they were gemologists or like jewelers, merchants of gemstones and things like that were pretty good at their job, but they just didn't have quite the tool set for the sort of chemical analysis that we can do now to really like I think even like the Mohs scale was not entirely beyond them, but like not really formalized in that way. They definitely knew that things like garnets and emeralds were softer, and things like, you know, rubies and sapphires were much harder. We just have the benefit of a couple more 100 years of really narrowing down those definitions and being able to like really determine like what is the chemical makeup of these minerals. So even without that, so without that, spinels and actual like corundum rubies were basically interchangeable in even the early modern period, when these Cheapside hoard items would have been created and possibly stowed away. They're both very hard. They're found in kind of the same places. They a lot of these were coming from like India and Sri Lanka. Like the trade was kind of starting to open up to those other places. They were found in very similar places. Rubies were obviously considered the more valuable because they tend to have a lot more clarity. They were harder. But spinels are basically just looked at to be lower quality rubies. And so even some extant spinels that we have, like this one very much on the left, this is in the modern England crown jewels, but the Black Prince ruby has been part of the crown jewels of England since the 14th century. And they always called it a ruby. In fact, it's sort of still called a ruby, but we have since learned that it is not a ruby, it is actually a spinel, a giant spinel, and one that has like really lovely clarity to it, but just chemically different stones.
Honey lemon.
Thank you. My husband got me honey lemon. He's very nice. And I pulled up a picture of like natural spinel stones to kind of show the sort of variation in colors that we get. You get pinks, you get oranges, you get reds, a few purples even. And then this last one is again another item from the Cheapside Hoard, which actually did have spinels in them. But this is put in place with sapphires. So sort of indicating that, like, again, it was sort of equivalent to like a sapphire or what we would think of as a true ruby. They were used very much interchangeably. All right, and so then what are the fakes made of? So hardness, like I said, is a really good indication, even sort of in the early modern era, of like what these stones were. Quartz is very hard. Whereas like sapphires and things are like further on like the 9 end of the Mohs scale, quartz is like a 7. So it's still quite hard, very durable, but quartz is everywhere. Quartz is silica, which is what composes most of quartz, is the single most abundant thing in the world. That's why concrete has sand in it, basically, because it's just so abundant and so cheap to come by. And there's a lot of circumstances under which quartz can be made. It doesn't need the really tough, like high pressure, high temperature environments that you get from these like tectonic movements, which is why you find a lot of rubies and things in Sri Lanka, in India, where those like tectonic mountain movements basically are creating the circumstances under which those really hard corundum stones are being created. These can grow in like geothermal pools. Like they can grow in a lot of circumstances that you just need a little bit of heat and you just need a little bit of pressure, geologically speaking, to create quartz crystal. And as a result, you kind of find it everywhere. They end up in sand deposits. They end up in igneous things. Like it's everywhere. So the Museum of London, in studying these 2 extant pieces, found that these were in fact rock crystal, but not just sort of clear rock crystal. They had been treated by a process that made them undergo thermal shock. And again, we'll get into that a little bit more too with some of the experiments that I ran. But as a result of that thermal shock, it sort of crazed on the inside and developed all of these little micro cracks. And they found that whatever the dye was, didn't actually dye the stone itself. The stone itself is still clear, it is still uncolored, but the inclusions that were then created in the quartz kind of sucked up those dye materials. So now, while the Museum of London and the Forsyth book do not actually say for sure, because it could be one of several things. They specifically give the 2 options between like some kind of mineral salt that is like a red color and some kind of organic dye. It's equally likely to be either one of those, because the important thing is not like any particular chemical reaction with the stone itself. It is like literally like the little bits that end up in the stone. I decided to use cochineal because we actually have a lot of information on it as a dye stuff in the 16th century. It is also really safe to use and handle. Like it's a food grade dye in most instances, whereas something like a mineral oxide or something could potentially be a little iffy. Again, I have small kids, so I decided to go with the cochineal. So one of the big resources for determining, like, you know, what did Renaissance people really know about cochineal was more a matter of this Italian text from about 50 years previous to these items. And it's called the Plictho of Gioventura Rossetti, which is a dye manual, a very like very in-depth dye manual even. It goes into tons and tons and tons of different recipes on how to dye and multiple colors, but like the red specifically used entirely what they called grain, which was basically cochineal. Cochineal was imported from Spanish colonizers into Europe, and really did a lot to sort of supplant the previous best red dye stuff, which was Kermes, which is actually a very similar thing. It's also an insect, and it also but it grows in like Siberia and Hungary and like very like Eastern Europe kind of places. Even according to the Plick, though, it Kermes was better. They at least thought so. But in taking some dye classes from Drea Lead several years ago, she talked about how like cochineal, because it was so abundant and they were able to import it, it sort of ended up supplanting Kermes as the sort of primary dye stuff for high quality reds by the 16th century and certainly much later. And madder and stuff, I guess, was kind of a cheaper quality dye. The really beautiful like gem, like jewel tony kind of reds and even kind of purples and oranges and stuff very much came from these kind of dyes. Excuse me. I hear chimes. Are there like questions or anything in the chat?
I am checking the chat right now, and I do not think there are. Nope.
Okay.
It might just be notifications.
It might just be notifications on my computer, so apologies. Okay. Ooh. So, and they sort of define terms in the Plick, though, of like what kind of particular colors you can get, which included cardinal, pinkish, quince, which it could be like a pink or it could even be like a yellowy color, kind of depending. Orange, loaded with color, scarlet, morello, which is kind of a like a reddish purpley color as far as I can tell. And like they talk about a lot of variations of the color crimson and doing it on multiple fiber types, on wool, on silk, on linen, on cotton. So really fun source for that, because even as well, in addition to like how to use cochineal, they talk about how to augment cochineal, because these red dyes in particular, I think even madder is subject to this, but definitely cochineal and Kermes are very pH sensitive, which means that as they are exposed to things that are more or less acidic or basic, that augments the color, much like cabbage does, going from like and using that as like a pH read basically. And they also define several different chemicals that you can use for that, most of which, very fortunately enough, are food safe and are available commercially for regular people. So I tend, and it's not like these are the only ones, but these are the ones that I could source easily. And that, like I said, I felt good about using in my home kitchen because literally much of this was already here. So good times. Yeah, so as you go more basic, as you add lime or soda ash, and I say soda ash is baking soda. I know technically it's washing soda, but when you get it wet, it becomes baking soda. So like it's kind of sixes. And then as you get more into like the alum and the more like acidic things, it gets far more red and even into orange. So I kind of played around with this a little bit. I think mostly it ended up kind of red purple when I did it, because also in the process of doing multiple firings, the color would get a little bit darker and even like maybe kind of browner. But I'll show you the final product that I had basically. But so the first thing I did was I tested out sort of, and I try to isolate the thermal shock capabilities of it, because quartz can withstand very high temperatures, but it's also like what temperatures are actually necessary. I have a kiln because I'm an enameler and do jewelry stuff. But I didn't need to kick it up to like 2000 degrees because that would give us a little bit too much thermal shock. If you then drop it into a thing of water, the things would just explode and turn into sand. So we don't want that. And so I think I even did test like very low, like kind of oven temperatures, and kind of had mixed results. Basically, it needs to be hot enough that when you pull it out of the oven and drop it into a cold bowl of liquid, it needs to sizzle. Because that and even like pop. The pop is the thermal shock. And that's what provides this wonderful sort of internal crazing that you get on the inside. From an otherwise like clear stone. You do not need to use very high quality stones for this. I would actually recommend against it, because you do kind of destroy them in the process of doing this. Like I said before about quartz being like a 7 on the Mohs scale, it then becomes like a 3. Like it becomes much softer. It has much more it's much more tendency to break and even kind of become brittle over time. Highly decreases the quality of the stone itself in the process of dyeing this. So I found it really pretty important to keep kind of a gentle hand. And that stones, when they go in, need to be very dry. If there's any moisture at all, it'll expand into steam and you're far more likely for things to break. Even if they don't necessarily react to it in like a kind of a slow oven, I just think that the chances of that, like, I wanted to give myself as many chances to end up with a usable product at the end. If things are very likely to chip, even with these kind of larger stones, or break apart into multiple pieces. And so you do need multiple passes to do it, which I did kind of learn the hard way because I was really disappointed in doing them once. I was like, oh, did I just not do something right? Did I not have enough dye? Like I tried to account for all these other factors. But basically, the effect is really kind of subtle until it's done, I would say at least like 2 or 3 times before you start getting that nice color. And I love this shot that I have of like the gradation, because like when you get to like 5 firings, it really does look like a different stone. And I think if I'd been a little more careful with the temperature, maybe tried it like slightly lower, maybe it wouldn't have that kind of purpley brown cast. But even so, like I think they work really well for that purpose. Yeah, and that there are diminishing returns. Again, the more times you fire it, the more you're getting those cracks into it, which gives it more color, but it also makes it much weaker. And then, oh, sorry, I talked really fast. But Toronto tap water gives you a light purple, as a group of us once discovered with coconut. Yeah, I also found, I live in Utah, which has very hard water, and I found very similar. We got kind of it's this color here, kind of a little purple, kind of a rosy color, like a very nice color. And then while the distilled water did lead far more into like the primary red, or even like when it's kind of diluted in the little pot like this, it's a little bit more orange even. Yeah, and if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to walk through the process. I have many actual stones. I found like kind of one of the best uses of them after I had done this competition piece was I actually made little pendants out of them. Again, I do jewelry stuff on my own anyway. Not even as complicated as the originals, which have these very cute like little enameled and soldered things, but just making little custom head pins, little enameled head pins. But you can... Ta-da!
You might want to unshare so we can see giant and big.
Oh no! Yes, I can. Sorry about that. Okay.
There we go.
Put it right up to the webcam.
Oh yeah.
There we go.
Ooh.
I think at the end of the day, they don't really look like spinels, but they do look like the Museum of London ones. So I was satisfied. There's this crazy story, and like we have the name of the guy who I think probably made them. His name was Simpson. It was George Simpson. What was his name?
Criminal.
Yeah. Thomas Simpson of Cheapside. So when I say that like the Goldsmiths Company of London had like all of the tea, this is what I'm talking about. So Thomas Simpson went around to other jewelers and enamelers and lapidaries and sourced out all of the little pieces for these things. And it's described as, and in the notes is described as a gold post with a clawed setting. Like I think they drive home very much like what these were. So it's like the book doesn't like go right out and say it, and they're like, it's really easy to think that he probably made these just because the descriptions match so well and the timelines match up so well. So that but anyway, he sourced all these parts out, but he probably did the dyeing on his own. And the other funny thing I always really like is that it wasn't actually illegal to take rock crystal and dye it a different color, or even to sell it as like as a counterfeit crystal. Like it's more like if you set it in gold and then mislead your buyer into thinking that it is like a proper ballast ruby, like that's the bad part. Like you could sell fake gemstones. There was a giant market for because gemstone jewelry was like super taking off because of all of these new trade routes that were opening up and all of these new resources that were coming into everybody.
So when you did them in the oven, I guess it was, how long did you leave them in there?
It really didn't take very much time. I had a little probe thermometer that I would try and kind of guess as to like what the temperature actually was, which doing it on a rock is like more or less a lesson in frustration. But I found like if you do it for like maybe between 5 and 10 minutes, that's enough time to get it into thermal shock. And I tried various things. I tried doing an iced dye bath, and I found that didn't actually make a ton of difference other than like potentially diluting the dye to the point of it not working as well, or like it would kind of hit the ice in the thermal shock before it kind of got into like the real, like where all the dye was, and so like it maybe wouldn't be quite as effective. I tried yeah, I tried an hour. I tried various lengths of time, and I found they were kind of pretty similar. But again, I found kind of a gentle hand was became a little bit more called for in order to try to minimize as much as possible that kind of cracking. I have another question here. You had to dry out the stone completely before the firing after the dyeing as well as the shocking. How long did that take? I always gave it overnight. Because again, I found that if I just tried to wait a couple minutes, if I tried to like put them on a towel and dry them off really well, I was more likely to get that kind of cracking. I would give them like an overnight cycle. And I mean, it would potentially probably take less time than that. I live in a pretty dry area, so that probably also helped. But like being out in the sun for an hour or two would probably help too. But this was all very much like an indoor activity, basically. So, but yeah, definitely give it a lot of time. I mean, there is probably always some small amount of water in it, just the nature of it sort of absorbing it. But again, just trying to minimize that as much as possible. Okay, anyway, about Thomas Simpson. So Thomas Simpson gets caught creating these, and like literally like they were considered to be these amazing counterfeits. They could not tell the difference between them and like these actual like rubies or spinels. Again, I feel like, I guess, like maybe if you were trying to sell them as like a really low quality spinel or a really low quality ruby, I don't know. But he sold them to a bunch of wholesalers who then took them to like India and on various trade routes where they like ruined the reputation of the Goldsmiths Company of London. This is according to the Goldsmiths Company's notes, so obviously maybe a biased source. But they put him on trial and they sent goons to his house to pick him up and force him to go to the Goldsmiths Company and face trial, and he refused. Like he fought him off and like never darkened the door of the Goldsmiths Company again for the rest of his life, basically. So this guy was nuts. But and was also like had a lot of audacity, I think, because like something happened while they were like investigating this, and they took one of these, again, I maybe not one of these particular extant stones, but like one of the stones that they determined to be counterfeit, and they showed it to a lapidary, and they're like, what do you think this is? And I was like, wow, this is a really great stone. But then like the more he looked at it, he's like, I cut this stone. So like it fooled even that guy, which was pretty funny. Yeah, never darken the door of the Goldsmiths Company again. Ruined the reputation of various trade companies, which is so much the better, I think. And was kind of just a, yeah, I really like how this guy Thomas Simpson kind of became famous for being kind of a weirdo and a cheat for like he would say like, and they were big stones. Like these stones are like more than an inch big. And so he'd be like, this is like a super valuable, this stone is worth 2,000 pounds. And like in 16th century money, that's a crazy amount of money. But I'll let it go to you for 800. And I'm gonna cut you in. So really fun stuff. I have one that's a little bit more purple. Show you that one too. So I have all the ones I have left. I started off with a ton. And again, I made a lot of largesse out of a bunch of them. Like I put them on a little pendant and I put like a little card about like what they were. But let me, yeah. Those are the ones I have left. And again, I did play with the pH kind of as I was doing it to try and see how much variation I can get with the color. And I got exactly that range, that some orange, some pink, some red, and some purple. I need to fix my webcam now. I'm sorry. There we go. So it turned out to be a little bit shorter than I thought. I talked really fast. And do you have your hand up, Med?
Yes, I do.
Go ahead.
I've got a couple questions.
Yeah,
The first one is, do you start with a bead as opposed like a pre-drilled piece of quartz as opposed to using like a solid piece at first?
I started with a pre-drilled bead because I had tested out trying to polish some of these on my own, and it just took so long, and I just didn't have like kind of the means for it yet. So I bought pre-drilled as rough as I could find in that size, which are like huge for quartz crystal beads.
Yeah, because I could never drill them on my own, but that just sounds awesome to try and do that and like give them to friends.
Totally. I'm here for it. But again, the record, like it sounds to me like the dyeing was the last thing he did before like doing the full like putting it together. So if these are both beads, so I would, and there are again, they interviewed the other people involved who were like unwittingly contributing to this counterfeiting, but not the guy himself. So like we don't know exactly how he did it, but he had an actual ballast ruby. He kind of had a mold made of it, which to me sounds kind of weird because like gemstones can be cut any number of ways. But he had it like cast as a model, and so he brought I guess a bunch of rock crystal and the model to some guy, the lapidary, and was like, can you make it look like this? And I think that's why they're kind of nuggety, but like they're kind of a tumbled rough, I would say. And I tried to find like 1.5 inch smooth tumbled stones, and like I couldn't. These are like kind of weirdly faceted. Like,
Oh, okay. Yeah.
yeah.
Oh.
And you can get much smaller ones on like Amazon. These I found, I think, at a gem show several years ago. They were spendy. So, which is why they are a pendant. Like there's not a necklace of them. Any more questions? I'm happy to like, I like this. This is just one of those random little projects that I really had a fun time researching.
I was wondering if you could suggest like sources or if you have documentation of how to do it, because this just sounds really cool.
I have the documentation for my entry, and I'm happy to share my bibliography too. These, I can share again my screen
Ooh.
to pull that up, and that'll show you all the resources that I had. So I kind of had to, I skirted the line a little bit between like the historical resources, which again are my Forsyth book, which is my favorite thing in the world. The plick though, like those were big of like kind of determining my process, and the actual extant Museum of London ones and the information that the museum provides. Those are my main like historical resources. Because of the nature of this project, I also did a fair bit of kind of a semi-scientific study of like what is quartz, what are rubies, like that kind of thing. So I found that was useful, at least to like educate the reader on like what the terminology means, kind of a thing. So let me.
People still do this.
Yeah, it's actually a modern craft. Like, if you look up like how to dye quartz, like I literally found websites about doing it. Like,
Quartz crack.
Oh.
yeah, it's called sometimes it's called like druzy quartz or crackled quartz, or you do it to marbles. Like,
Of course, yeah.
yeah, it's the same thing, basically.
Because like I really need another hobby, but I mean that's something I could. This
One
type of thing I
hobby.
could do in my
Just one
apartment.
hobby, guys.
I know we need another hobby, like a hole in our head. But
Oh,
yeah, you don't want to see my apartment.
here.
But this is something like even people without a house could actually do.
Oh, I don't have a house, but yeah,
Yeah.
I did test out because I like I'm gonna recreate a little miniature fire pit, and I'm gonna fire them in like sand. It didn't work. Like they would just pop and crackle and get black spots, and it was awful. So like,
Eh. They probably used an oven of some sorts anyways,
yeah.
especially in later periods. I mean, why wouldn't they?
So the opening picture is from an illuminated manuscript that shows like different occupations. And it is a goldsmith, and this is common. Goldsmiths worked kind of at a desk when you think about it. I mean, they usually had access to some kind of like medium to largish size forge or something. But if you're just like soldering or trying to heat something up, or like anneal metal or something, they just have this little tiny, like a little bowl with coals in it. And usually like you would solder with like a blowpipe or something to get like a really hot point
Mhm.
for that. But And again, that's what I was like trying to recreate. And I sort of made a little, I made a little sort of display of like my thing, but I didn't actually use it to dye any stones because I am not a Elizabethan goldsmith and did not learn how to do that from the time that I was a teenager. So
Yeah.
I think I like, because I keep looking at like, you know, like making like Turkish coffee and stuff and like heating it in the sand. I kept thinking like, well, maybe that's like a good avenue for that. But like I, for one, like I didn't have the skill to get that to work. So
Yeah, I tried doing quills once. Luckily, I was at a cottage, so but I saved cans from soup,
yeah,
and I put the sand in the soup or in the soup can,
yeah,
and then I put the can in the oven on like a baking sheet.
yeah.
My parents thought I was crazy, but they thought it was interesting too, and it worked because I was trying to do um
Yeah,
the hardening of the quill part, like the whatever you call it, a block nib part. There we go.
Nib.
I'll get the word from eventually.
fully get you. So, so I just put them in the oven and that the sort of air, like a low, like it's like 450 degrees to 500 degrees, something like that. Like, so for an oven, it's kind of hot, but like in general, it was like not terribly hot. Like a fire was too hot and would heat too unevenly in,
Yeah.
if I were, like I said, if I were more skilled at it, like I maybe like, but um let's see.
Well, I
Uh
probably would have had some sort of thing to hold the things on, and then you
yeah.
could adjust the temperatures or something, I guess, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah,
Mm.
I tried various combinations of like putting it on a mandrel, putting it on, like I said, putting it in, like burying it in sand. It either just wouldn't get hot at all or it would get too hot in one part and then it would break. Um, I will say that the Plictho is available on archive.org, which is where I found it for my research on this.
Yeah, I
The
grabbed a copy. I copied the text so I can look at it later.
it's actually, I found it highly readable. It's an English translation of the original text. And it's a pretty good one. Like it's not super archaic or anything. Drea Lead had talked about at one time. She like, if you get more into the dye craft of it, because like this is not even the only class that utilizes the plick though. I think this is like maybe the third.
Yeah, well, I see one of our other attendees. They do a lot of
Yeah.
dyeing with the Tadek was talking about it earlier.
Well, I took some classes from her at 50 years, so this was like ages ago. But she talked about how she found it really useful. The Plicklo is a period source, like one of the earliest period sources we have for dyeing. But when you get into like the 18th century, the recipes are the same, but the methodology is far more scientific because they're getting into that like a little more chemical analysis, a little more like um like what are things doing on the chemical level in that.
Mm-hmm.
She found between the two books, even though like yes, the other book is not period, again, because the recipes were the same, like you can look at the Plichther recipes of like why are they using alum to do X and Y, and it's like, oh, it's because they're trying to achieve this color and this result, which is really interesting, I think. So
Oh, that's how we ended up with the lavenderish color from the Toronto chap.
yes.
Yeah, after that we used distilled water for the dye because it was dyeing fabric and threads that we were doing. Just it was throw stuff in a pot to see what happens. And
Yeah.
someone had cochineal. We just used tap water and yeah, I still have it somewhere.
And here's the Museum of London listing.
Um,
They don't have both. And again, they're very similar. So like I guess that's why they don't have both of them. Um, but they have a lot of like really great pictures from all angles of it.
oh, nice close-up image.
And I also one of the reasons I also decided to use cochineal is because these ended up so orange, and I had a hypothesis that it maybe was because it was buried so long and it was in maybe kind of an acidic environment, maybe that had
Um,
color. in a way that maybe it might not have done with some kind of mineral-based pigment. That was
that would make
still
sense.
kind of
Yeah.
a hypothesis. So hard to tell one way or another, but
Well, it affected the pearls, so yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
yeah. So, yeah. And again, also like I didn't want to mess with like I had dyed things before. So like
Mhm.
Coachella was very much like a known entity for me. And if they basically act the same, I didn't feel the need to like reinvent the wheel, basically.
Yeah. Well, and they would have used the same stuff
So,
anyways. So, like, anything that would give you a red, whatever you could get your hands on, I guess.
I hope this was interesting for everyone. This
I
crazy.
found it fascinating.
Yes. I know when this morning when we were getting together to start the day, I was saying, "Oh yeah, I'm going to the quartz dyeing one," and the response is, "There's a quartz dyeing one?" I'm like, "Oh, that's really cool."
There's a lot of cool classes into this thing, so it's hard to choose on everything.
I know, I get it. So I'm very glad to do it. I'm glad we got to talk for an hour and not just me lecturing. So
Oh yeah.
I do apologize for not having a demonstration, but man, COVID is awful. Like,
That's what I've heard. I've been lucky. I've escaped it as far as I can tell. So
not fun.
Yeah.
I have had this cough since before Christmas. And
oh,
it started getting better and then it took a turn and got worse. And now it's like maybe hopefully getting better again. We'll see.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
I've
it
heard
does
that story from a few people. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
it
I'm
does
going to
I've
stop
had whooping cough,
recording.
so I get it.
oh
gonna-
yeah,
I've had whooping cough, so I totally get that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we
I'm
might as well stop recording this.
we can
Yeah.
stop recording.